I pulled my chair a little closer to the table, the air still heavy with the scent of lilies from the funeral last week. My husband's absence was already a hole in the room, and now here we were, gathered for the will. That was when my daughter-in-law leaned back, her eyes sharp, her smile thin, and said it. Now it's my turn. She said it once, then again, like the words tasted sweet in her mouth. My stomach dropped as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water over me. Everyone looked at her, then looked at me. I didn't say a word. I just pressed my palms flat against the table to keep them from shaking. The sound of the grandfather clock in the hall ticked louder than any voice in the room. My son cleared his throat but didn't speak. The lawyer shuffled his papers slowly, maybe on purpose, maybe to buy time. I kept my face calm, but inside, my thoughts were racing. Was she really that bold, to declare victory before a single page was read? I thought we had gathered here to honor my husband's memory, to hear his wishes, to settle things quietly. Instead, it felt like the opening act of a show I never asked to attend. Her smirk was so confident it reminded me of a poker player laying down what she thought was a winning hand. My chest tightened, but I didn't lean back. I stayed right there, eyes fixed on her. I wanted her to see that I had heard every word. And still, I said nothing. Silence is sometimes louder than the sharpest reply. You know, I had walked into that room expecting grief, not theater. The curtains were drawn halfway, the late afternoon sun painting gold stripes across the carpet. On the table were cups of lukewarm coffee, a half-empty plate of shortbread cookies, and a stack of manila envelopes that held my husband's words. My younger son shifted in his seat, avoiding my gaze. He always hated conflict. My older son rubbed the back of his neck, eyes darting between his wife and the lawyer. She, meanwhile, leaned forward, resting her chin on her manicured hand, like this was a social game she had already won. Part of me had wanted to believe the gathering would be solemn, maybe even tender. I imagined us remembering his laugh, his Sunday habits, the way he folded the newspaper just so. Instead, the air smelled faintly of perfume too strong for the occasion, and the sound of a foot tapping under the table. My daughter-in-law looked like she had been rehearsing that line for days, maybe weeks. Now it's my turn. She tossed it out like a headline, as if this story belonged to her. I sat very still, my heart pounding so hard I thought the others might hear it. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. A woman my age learns how to hold her tongue in front of an audience, even when every nerve wants to shout. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, pretending not to notice the tension, though his hand lingered on the first page longer than necessary. He must have felt it too. Her words kept echoing. Now it's my turn. Turn for what? To take? To claim? To erase what had come before? The room was quiet except for that clock. I stared at the thin hands circling, each tick pulling us deeper into something I wasn't sure I could stop. And yet, beneath all the shock, there was something else building in me. Not anger, not yet. Clarity. It felt like watching storm clouds gather on the horizon, dark and undeniable. I knew something had shifted, and there would be no turning back. What I didn't know then was just how far she was willing to go, or how quickly the rest of the family would show their true colors. If you've ever been in a room where you suddenly realize you're the only one without a mask, you know that strange hollow sensation. That's what it was like. My hands were steady on the table, but my insides trembled. She leaned back again, a little satisfied sigh slipping out, as if the outcome was already written. The lawyer cleared his throat once more, finally lifting the envelope. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just about inheritance. It wasn't just about money, or property, or even my husband's final words. This was about power, about who would stand tall in that family now that he was gone. My daughter-in-law thought it would be her. She thought I would stay silent forever. But here's the thing, silence can be mistaken for weakness, but it can also be preparation. I hadn't said a word yet, and she didn't realize what I had brought with me that day. Before I tell you what happened when the papers were finally read, let me ask you this. Have you ever watched someone dig their own grave with their own words, too sure of themselves to notice the shovel in their hands? That's what I was watching. And I let her keep digging. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't to fight right away, it's to wait. Let the room grow quiet, let everyone lean forward, hungry for what comes next. And trust me, what came next would change everything. Make sure you stay with me, because the story is only beginning. You won't believe what happened when the envelope finally opened and the truth came out. Now, let's go back to where this all really started with me, the woman they thought would never speak up. I had told myself the morning of the meeting that it would be simple. A lawyer at the table, a few signatures, some quiet nods, and then I'd go home to an empty house that still smelled of my husband's aftershave. That was the picture I held in my head while I got dressed, pulling on a dark cardigan and smoothing my hair in the mirror. I even packed a small tin of butter cookies, because he used to say every gathering should have something sweet at the end. But when I stepped into that room, I knew almost instantly that sweetness wasn't on the menu. The blinds were half drawn, slicing the sunlight into stripes across the rug. The lawyer's briefcase sat neatly by his chair, polished leather that reflected a thin line of gold. My older son was on his phone, scrolling, tapping, trying to look distracted. His wife, my daughter-in-law, was already leaning back, nails painted a shade too bright for morning. My younger son fiddled with his watch, avoiding everyone's eyes. The air was thick with things unsaid. Coffee cups clinked gently as if that sound could drown out the tension. I set my tin of cookies on the table like a peace offering, but no one reached for them. Not one hand moved. In my mind, I had pictured something different. I thought we would gather and maybe share a memory or two. I imagined my sons remembering how their father taught them to ride bikes, how he grilled steaks every 4th of July, how he laughed so loud the neighbors heard through the hedges. I thought we might even cry together, the kind of tears that knit people closer. Instead, what I got was my daughter-in-law asking, before anyone had even opened a page, "So, when do we get to the part that matters?" Her smile was thin, and her voice carried the weight of someone who wanted the show to begin. My younger son winced, my older one shifted, but said nothing. The lawyer just kept stacking his papers, slow, methodical, like he was deliberately pretending not to hear. And me? I sat very still, though my insides twisted. I had learned over the years that in a family like ours, the first one to speak often lost the ground under her feet. Better to wait, better to let the silence draw its own shape. Still, there were small signals everywhere. The way she glanced at the clock, as though her time was too valuable. The way she tapped her finger against her glass of water, each tap like a drumbeat of impatience. Even the way she smoothed her blouse, tugging it sharp across her lap, as if she were about to stand up and make an announcement. My husband would never have liked this, I thought. He had always been deliberate, careful with words, respectful of the weight they carried. He once told me, "In times of grief, what you don't say matters just as much as what you do." And yet here we were, in a room where words were already being flung like stones before the ceremony even began. I looked at my sons again. The younger one avoided my eyes, tracing the edge of his watch like he could wind time backward. The older one gave the smallest shrug, a gesture I knew too well it meant he had already surrendered. And beside him, his wife smiled with that sharp, satisfied curve of someone who thought the game was rigged in her favor. The lawyer finally cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "We'll begin shortly," he said, but the tension had already begun long before. I could feel it pressing against the walls, filling the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. My mind wandered for a moment, back to the days before this. The phone calls, the short texts. "We'll meet at the house, Mom. The lawyer will explain everything." No warmth, no comfort, just logistics typed out in blue bubbles. I had brushed it off, telling myself it was grief, making them blunt. But sitting there, I realized it wasn't grief, it was calculation. It struck me then how often I had ignored little signs like this over the years. The birthday where she rolled her eyes at the gift I gave. The Thanksgiving where she announced loudly that she was running this kitchen now. The countless times she dismissed my words with a wave of her manicured hand. They were all pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to assemble. But here, at this table, the picture was clear. She caught me looking at her and tilted her head slightly, as if to say, "What?" As if daring me to challenge her. My throat felt dry, but I kept my face calm. I had promised myself I would not give her the satisfaction of watching me break. The cookies sat untouched in the center of the table. The lawyer's fountain pen gleamed in the light. My younger son finally muttered something about the air conditioning being too high, but no one answered. My older son kept his eyes fixed on the table as though it held secrets only he could see. And me? I folded my hands in my lap, steadying them, reminding myself to breathe. I thought of my husband's words again, about silence and wait, about how sometimes the storm is best met not with shouting but with steel. Because even though the meeting had barely begun, I knew this wasn't going to be the peaceful remembrance I had imagined. This was going to be something else entirely. Something darker. What I didn't realize yet was just how much darker it would get once the lawyer opened that first page. This wasn't the first time she had tried to cut me down. That's the part most people wouldn't see, looking in from the outside. They would see a young wife, polished nails, expensive blouse, sitting beside her husband and offering tight smiles. But I had lived through the smaller moments, the ones that stacked up slowly like bricks until they formed a wall between us. I thought back to the first Thanksgiving after she married into the family. My husband had carved the turkey the same way he always did, careful, neat slices, a tradition he took pride in. I remember her standing up halfway through the meal, clapping her hands once and saying, "All right, from now on I'm running this kitchen." It wasn't said with humor. It was said like a declaration, as if she had claimed territory. I laughed it off at the time, thinking maybe she was nervous. Maybe she wanted to fit in. But the way she looked at me, chin tilted, eyes sharp, told me it wasn't nerves at all. Then there was the birthday she forgot. Not hers, not her husband's, but mine. I had spent hours making a cake for her the year before, wrapping a gift, hosting her friends when she couldn't manage it herself. But when my birthday came around, she walked into the house empty-handed, smiled, and said, "Oh, I didn't think you'd want to make a fuss at your age." She didn't even lower her voice. My sons shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, but no one corrected her. I cut the cake myself that year. The moments kept coming. When her child was sick, I stayed up 3 nights in a row, spooning medicine, holding a cool cloth to a hot forehead. She dropped by once during that week, looked at me in the kitchen, and said, "Well, that's what grandmothers are for, right?" Then she left before dinner was even ready. No thank you. Not even a nod. And the worst part wasn't the words. It was the way the rest of them went along with it. My husband used to tell me not to let it get to me. "She'll settle down," he'd say, patting my hand. "Don't stir up trouble." So I swallowed it again and again, thinking maybe time would soften her edges. But time only sharpened them. Now here we were, in this room, and I realized all those little moments had been rehearsals for today. Every smirk, every slight, every dismissive wave of her hand, it had all been building to this. She wanted control, and with my husband gone, she thought her chance had finally arrived. I studied her across the table, the way she leaned into her chair like she already owned the outcome. My older son, her husband, sat close, but not close enough to touch her. He didn't defend me. He never really did. Maybe he thought silence was safer. My younger son glanced between us nervously, his fingers still circling the edge of his watch like he could spin the moment away. The lawyer hadn't even spoken yet, but the air felt charged, like lightning waiting to strike. My daughter-in-law tapped her nails against her water glass. 3 sharp beats, then a pause, then 3 more. A signal to herself, maybe, like a drum roll before her performance. I sat back, letting the memories wash over me, each one a reminder that this wasn't sudden. This was a storm that had been brewing for years. I remembered Christmas 2 years ago, when she presented my husband with a sweater folded neatly in a box. She made a point of saying, loud enough for me to hear, "I picked it because I know your taste better than anyone." My husband laughed, tried it on, said it was too snug. She grinned anyway, eyes flicking toward me like she had scored a point in a game only she was playing. She had always been playing a game. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. Sitting there in that heavy silence, I realized the truth. This wasn't about inheritance for her. It was about rewriting the story, making herself the center, pushing me to the margins until I was no longer visible. And I also realized something else. She thought I wouldn't fight back. She had mistaken my patience for surrender. But patience isn't the same as weakness. Patience can be strategy. And while she thought she had been winning all these years, I had been paying attention to the looks, the words, the patterns. I had kept quiet, but I hadn't been blind. The clock ticked again, steady, relentless. My throat was tight, but my mind was clear. I thought of my husband, the way he always urged me to stay composed. He would never have wanted a shouting match, but he would have wanted me to stand my ground. And in that moment, I knew that's exactly what I would do. Because this wasn't just about a line in a will. This was about years of being dismissed, erased, treated as if I were a placeholder in my own family. This was about showing her, and maybe everyone else in that room, that I wasn't going anywhere. So I waited, silent, letting the lawyer shuffle his papers. And when he finally cleared his throat to read the first line, I folded my hands tighter in my lap. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of watching me break. I wasn't going to flinch. What she didn't know and what none of them knew was that I was ready. And when the right moment came, I would no longer be silent. The lawyer finally lifted the envelope, his hands steady but his eyes darting quickly across the table. The room grew still, in a way that made every small sound seem louder. The scrape of my daughter-in-law's chair as she shifted, the faint creak of the old house settling, the sharp tick of the clock marking every passing second. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. My client, your husband, left instructions regarding the division of his estate. His voice was calm, professional, almost detached. But every word felt heavy, like a stone being placed on the table. I kept my eyes on him, though I could feel hers drilling into me from across the room. She was waiting, hungry, certain she knew what was coming. She leaned forward, her fingers tapping the table in a rhythm only she could hear. When the lawyer paused to flip a page, she smirked and whispered, not quite under her breath, "Just hurry it up. We all know how this ends." My older son glanced at her sharply, but said nothing. My younger son shifted uncomfortably, his knee bouncing under the table. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, every muscle tight but controlled. The lawyer continued, "Certain assets, including personal belongings, savings, and property, are to be distributed as outlined." He began listing items, naming accounts, describing terms. My daughter-in-law kept nodding, her lips curved into that thin smile, as though she were hearing confirmation of everything she believed. At one point, she even whispered, "See? Told you?" to her husband, who only rubbed the back of his neck and stared at the table. I listened carefully, but not just to the lawyer. I listened to the silence that followed each line, to the way the words hung in the air, and how no one dared fill the gaps. I could almost hear my husband's voice in the careful phrasing, the deliberate choices. He had always been precise, never careless with words. And in those words, I began to hear something she didn't. Then it came. The lawyer reached for a second folder, heavier than the first, and laid it flat on the table. And finally, there are provisions regarding the family home and associated holdings. He spoke slowly, his voice deliberate. My daughter-in-law straightened, her smirk widening. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She thought the house would be hers to claim, her stage, her trophy. The lawyer read on. It was my client's express wish that the family home remain under the stewardship of his wife, to be maintained in her name, with rights to pass it down as she chooses. The air seemed to shatter, though no one moved. My daughter-in-law froze, her smile slipping for the first time. She blinked once, then again, as if she hadn't heard correctly. My older son sat rigid, his jaw tight. My younger son exhaled quietly, like he had been holding his breath the whole time. I stayed still, but inside, I felt the smallest flicker of warmth. My husband had thought of me. He had written me into the foundation of this family, and no amount of smirking or sneering could erase that. But she wasn't done. "That can't be right," she snapped, leaning forward, her voice sharper now. "Read it again." The lawyer did not flinch. "It is written clearly. The home and associated properties are to remain in his wife's name." He tapped the document lightly, as though underlining the point. She turned toward her husband. "You're just going to sit there? Say something." He shifted in his seat but didn't answer. Her voice rose higher. This isn't fair. He knew we needed. She cut herself off, realizing how her words sounded. Needed or wanted. The distinction hung in the air. The silence that followed was louder than her outburst. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. I leaned forward then, not quickly, but with deliberate calm. My voice was steady, quiet enough that everyone leaned closer to hear. Are you sure you want to keep going? Her head snapped toward me, eyes wide. For a moment she didn't answer. Her smirk had vanished, replaced with something rawer panic, maybe, or disbelief. The lawyer cleared his throat once more, sensing the tension but pressing on. There are further provisions, he said, that specify charitable donations, funds for grandchildren, and safeguards for future management. He turned the page, all of which are to be overseen by his wife. It was too much for her to contain. She pushed back her chair, the legs screeching against the rug, and stood up. This is a joke, she said. It has to be. Her voice cracked, and she looked around the room, waiting for someone to agree. No one did. My older son stared down at his hands. My younger son kept his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. I sat there, still and calm, my hands folded neatly on the table. For the first time in years, the silence in that room didn't feel heavy on me. It felt like armor. She had spoken boldly, certain she was the victor. But now, with every word of the will, her certainty was unraveling. And though I didn't smile, I let the moment sink in. This wasn't just about property. This was about respect. About a voice that could no longer be silenced, not by her smirks, not by her words. I looked at her one more time, and in that quiet, I thought, you wanted your turn. Well, this is mine. The lawyer closed the folder with a soft click. The meeting wasn't over, not yet. But the balance had shifted, and she knew it. What came next would test us all. But for the first time in a long while, I was ready. Her chair scraped back so sharply it made everyone flinch. She stood there, red blotches spreading across her cheeks, eyes flashing as if the lawyer had insulted her personally. This isn't right, she said again, louder this time. You're twisting his words. The lawyer didn't even look up. He simply tapped the document once more, his tone calm, professional, almost indifferent. I'm reading exactly what your father-in-law signed. She turned on her husband then, stabbing the air with her finger. You're really going to let this happen? To your own family? To us? His shoulders slumped. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but no words came. My younger son shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if wishing he could disappear into the rug. Her voice grew sharper. We sacrificed for this family. We deserve something, she said. We. But her eyes were locked on me. Every word was a dart thrown in my direction. I could feel the sting, but I didn't flinch. I leaned forward just slightly, enough to make her stop pacing. You talk about sacrifice, I said quietly, but tell me, what exactly have you sacrificed? The room went still. My older son rubbed his temple, eyes shut tight. The lawyer's pen hovered above the page, waiting. She opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came. Just silence, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I continued, my voice still even, steady. When your child was sick, who sat by that bed night after night? When this house needed repairs, who wrote the checks without hesitation? When there were bills that couldn't be paid, who found a way? I paused, letting each question land. It wasn't you. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked around for support, but no one moved. My younger son's gaze dropped to the floor. My older son stared at his hands. Even the lawyer kept his eyes on the paper, as if the truth was too heavy to meet head-on. Her anger turned frantic. You're twisting everything. You think you can paint yourself as the hero, but we all know. Her voice cracked, and she stopped short. The confidence that had carried her into this room was unraveling with every word she spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You wanted your turn, I said softly. Well, this is it. And what you're showing us now, that's your turn. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. She looked at me as though I had struck her, but all I had done was hold up a mirror. The lawyer finally cleared his throat, his voice steady. If we could continue, there are additional provisions for grandchildren, for charitable donations, he went on, but the tension in the room was no longer about the words on the page. It was about the shift no one could ignore. My daughter-in-law sank back into her chair, but not gracefully. She folded her arms tight across her chest, her nails digging into her sleeves. Her eyes were hard, but her mouth trembled. She had walked into this meeting expecting triumph. Instead, she sat there exposed. My older son finally spoke, his voice low, almost tired. Maybe we should just respect what Dad wanted. He didn't look at her when he said it. He didn't look at me either. He stared straight ahead, as though speaking to the air. Her head snapped toward him. Respect? You're siding with her? He didn't answer, and that silence said more than any words could. The lawyer finished his reading and set the papers down neatly, folding his hands. That concludes the formal reading. His tone suggested finality, but the air in the room was far from settled. My younger son stood first, smoothing his jacket nervously. I think we all need a break, he murmured, his voice shaking slightly. He glanced at me, his eyes soft, then quickly looked away. I stayed seated, my hands still folded in my lap. I could feel every eye in the room, even hers, waiting for me to move. But I didn't. Not yet. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is sit perfectly still while everyone else falls apart. She finally broke the silence. This isn't over, she said, her voice low, dangerous. But even as she said it, her eyes betrayed her. There was no victory in them, only fear. I met her gaze, steady and calm. No, I said. It isn't. The lawyer gathered his papers, slipping them back into the briefcase. Chairs shuffled, footsteps echoed on the rug. My daughter-in-law pushed past, her perfume sharp and overwhelming, but she didn't meet my eyes again. The meeting was over, but the battle had only shifted ground, and deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of something larger. What none of them realized not yet was that I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The house grew quiet after the lawyer left. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the hall, leaving only the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My sons drifted off in different directions, each carrying his own silence. My younger one slipped outside, his footsteps quick, like he couldn't get away fast enough. My older son lingered by the dining room window, staring out at the yard but not really seeing anything. And my daughter-in-law, well, she moved fast, too. She gathered her purse, shoved her chair back without care, and walked out with her head high, but her eyes gave her away. The fire in them had dimmed. I sat there for a long moment, my hands still folded neatly in my lap. The tin of cookies was still sitting on the table, unopened, untouched. I reached for it finally, opening the lid just enough to take one. The familiar smell of butter and sugar rose up, and for a brief moment I felt my husband beside me. He always said the smallest things could soften the hardest days. As I chewed slowly, I thought back to his words, the ones he had repeated to me over the years. Don't let noise take your peace. Hold steady, and the truth will hold steady with you. Today, for the first time in a long while, I felt the truth standing with me. I looked around the room, the heavy curtains, the family photographs, the faint scratches on the dining table from years of dinners, arguments, laughter. This house held our story. It held mine. And now, by his choice, it would continue to. Not because I fought for it in that room, but because he had seen me all along, even when others tried to erase me. My older son finally turned from the window. His face was pale, drawn, but there was something softer in his eyes than I'd seen before. Mom, he said quietly. I didn't know Dad had written it that way. I nodded, still calm. Your father knew what mattered. He looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he just nodded back. Then he left the room, his footsteps slow, heavy. When I was alone again, I let out the breath I had been holding for hours. My shoulders slumped, my hands trembled a little, but my heart felt steadier than it had in months. I realized then that the fight had never really been about money, or even the house. It was about something deeper. It was about whether I would let myself be pushed into the shadows, or whether I would step forward and take the place that was mine all along. The air felt different now, cleaner somehow. Even with the tension still hanging in the corners of the house, even with the storm that I knew would follow, I felt lighter. For years I had been quiet, swallowing words, holding my tongue for the sake of keeping peace. But silence hadn't brought peace. It had only given her space to grow louder. Today, for once, silence had worked in my favor. Not the silence of surrender, but the silence of strength, of waiting, of letting her reveal herself, while I waited for the truth to speak louder than any argument. I closed the cookie tin and stood, smoothing my cardigan. The late afternoon sun had shifted, sending long beams across the floor. Dust motes danced in the light, floating gently, like reminders that even in stillness there was movement. I walked into the living room, pausing at the photograph on the mantel our wedding day. My husband in his dark suit, his smile easy and warm. Me in a dress that felt too big, holding flowers that shook in my nervous hands. We had built a life together in this house. And even though he was gone, I could feel him here, in the walls, in the floor, in the quiet strength that had carried me through the day. I placed my hand on the frame and whispered, almost to myself, "I hope you saw me today. I hope you know I heard you, even now." The sound of the front door opening pulled me back. My younger son peeked in, his face uncertain. "Mom?" he asked softly. I smiled at him just a little. "I'm all right," I said, and for the first time it felt true. He walked toward me, hesitated, then hugged me tightly, like he had when he was a boy. His shoulders shook once, and I realized he had been carrying fear too, the fear of what might happen if I fell apart. I held him until his breathing steadied. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet but clear. "She'll come back angry," he said. "I know," I answered. "But when she does, I'll still be here. This house will still be here, and so will you." He nodded, a little stronger this time. Then he left again, closing the door gently behind him. I stood there alone once more, but not lonely. The house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a home that had endured, like I had endured. As evening settled, I poured myself a cup of tea, the kind my husband always brewed on cold nights. I sat at the table, finally tasting one of those cookies, and let the quiet fill the room. It wasn't empty silence anymore. It was mine. And as I looked toward the closed door, I thought of my daughter-in-law's words. Now it's my turn. She had spoken them like a threat, like a promise of victory. But sitting there, in my home, with the will signed and sealed, I realized the truth. It wasn't her turn at all. It had always been mine. And for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to claim it.